Well, if you'll open your Bibles at that passage in Genesis that we've just read together, Genesis chapter 4 verses 16 and through to Genesis chapter 5 verse 32. This passage seems to do two things. First of all, it completes for us the story of Cain and his descendants. Secondly, it introduces us to Seth and his descendants. And especially we're drawn attention to the fact that Seth, as it were, replaces Abel. Indeed, Eve says that specifically. The Lord has given me another child in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. Now, bearing in mind last week we noticed that when God cursed the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 and referred to an ongoing enmity between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed, that we learnt last week that wasn't between serpents and human beings. It was between the righteous and the unrighteous. And effectively, therefore, what chapter 4 and chapter 5 is doing for us is to trace the descendants of Cain, who are identified, therefore, as the seed of the serpent, and the descendants of Seth, who are specifically identified as the sons of God at the beginning of chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2. So we're having introduced to us two different groups of humanity. Those who sought God. It's very specific at the end of chapter 4 that in the days that are specifically mentioned relating to Seth's descendants, people called upon the name of the Lord. So you have that group, and then you have, by contrast, the group of the descendants of Cain. And they are opposed in various ways, in very subtle ways, in these two stories. Sometimes folks say to me, how on earth can you preach from a genealogy? Well, the answer is, if you ask what the genealogy is for and notice what's going on, actually genealogies can be some of the most exciting parts of the Bible to teach on. Well, I think so. You'll have to judge for yourself whether that's true. Now notice what happens then in the story of Cain. I want to make some brief comments about Cain and Seth and then just look a little bit more in detail as we draw to a conclusion. The first then is that we are told that Cain leaves Eden, but more than that, he leaves the presence of God. And he goes to live in the land of Nod. You won't find Big Ears there. You won't find Mr. Plod. This is not Noddy's Noddy land. This is the land of Nod. And if you look at the bottom of your Bible notes, you'll find that it refers to Nod and says, Nod means in the Hebrew language, wandering. Cain was told that he would be a wanderer, and this is being fulfilled here. He goes to live in the land of Nod, the land of wandering, the land of insecurity, the land of inner disharmony. That's the sort of a land that he lives in. And because he lived in that land, we're told he built a city. Actually, more accurately, that could be rendered, he sought to build a fortified city. Now, I love Time Team and all the other archaeological programs on television. It probably arises from the fact that my first degree was in archaeology and anthropology. And I may be a very rusty archaeologist, but I've sort of still got something of the archaeologist in me. And so I love those programs and the way that they uncover the past. But one of the things, of course, that they invariably discover when they're working on their digs is they discover castles and other places which are defence works. Almost everywhere they go, they find men and women have sought to defend themselves. And Cain finds he needs to defend himself. Well, why? Why do we need to defend ourselves? Why did Cain need to defend himself? We need to defend ourselves because of our insecurities, because our world is an insecure place, because sin has entered into the world. And when that happens, we find ourselves in this wandering, insecure, troubled environment in which we need somehow to provide defense against the enemy. And already we discover in this story the way in which sin is beginning to outwork itself. It's interesting too that when Eve has her son Seth, she indicates that by the very name that, or rather Seth's son name, Enosh, indicates that they were aware of that problem, whether it was the Cainites or the Sethites. They were aware of this, the insecurity of human existence, because Enosh means weak, vulnerable. They were naming a strange name to give to a child, but in naming the child was recognizing the reality of the world in which that young man would live up and grow. Now, let's just look a little bit more detail into these two stories. First of all, we'll look at the Cainites in the end of chapter 4. I've already drawn your attention to the fact that when Cain builds a city, it implies that he is aware of need. But whereas we might have expected him to look to the Lord for help, actually he engages in self-help. That's the first thing we notice. When people live apart from God, characteristic of that life is self. And if we're going to help ourselves and get on and defend ourselves on whatever it is we feel that needs to be done, and we don't have faith in God, then we engage in self-help. It's interesting that while Cain still seems to imply that he had some sort of residual faith. Did you notice that most of the descendants of Cain that I named in reading that passage ended with E-L? Mehushael. Now the E-L is actually the name for God in the Hebrew language. So while they were living self-driven lives, the Cainites nevertheless gave God a look. They weren't complete unbelievers. It was just that God was sort of up there as some sort of magic token in the corner. You use him to name your child. You hope that by using that somehow God will be got on side. And we live in a society where that's often true, don't we? It was very interesting when the census came out that the conclusion was reached from the evidence on the census that Norwich is the most ungodly city in the country. And of course they immediately sent all their reporters off to speak to the Bishop of Norwich. And the Bishop of Norwich said, the interesting thing is in Norwich we have our churches are full. And it's true, whether it's Baptists, Methodists, Anglicans, whatever it is. He said the reason why there were so few people in Norwich who said they were Church of England it was in Norwich they know whether they are Christians or not. And so they're not tempted to put the fail-safe answer back, Church of England, in their answers. On the contrary, he says, it's evidence that people in Norwich do know something about the Christian message and know whether they're in or out. But we live in a society where people will put the fail-safe claim down. They'll want some sort of religious event to take place associated with the birth of a child or a marriage or a death. They want the guarantees that will bring. They have some residual belief in God, but he's only there to call in in those circumstances where we can't deliver for ourselves. And we see that immediately